The cow, like the stinging nettle or the armadillo or the sparrowhawk, is a natural product. Ages ago, it was rather different from its present self. Like every other living thing, it became what it is by adapting to its conditions. It changed down the centuries according to where it lived, to its climate, its food, its neighbors. In different places, it developed differently. It became fat or lean, shaggy, smooth, tall, short, fierce or placid. But in the development of cattle, nature has not been left to go it alone, as she was with the nettle and the sparrowhawk. As soon as man himself had evolved into what he is, he began to meddle in the business of evolution. He found he could persuade living things to evolve in the directions he chose. He could change their circumstances. More important, he could abolish natural selection and make his own. Changing the circumstances would change the cattle, if he could afford to wait around for a few thousand generations. But being an impatient creature, man prefers results in his lifetime, and he gets them. The great cattle breeds, the Hereford, the Longhorn, the Charolais, didn't happen by natural chance or a change in the weather. They were invented by men. So were these cattle. On a little island in the Scottish Hebrides, in 1947, 3 Scottish farming brothers, Shane, Dennis, and Ralph Cadzow, set out to design a new cow. They commandeered natural selection. They turned Darwinian theory into an industry. The island is Lyng, and Lyng beef cattle are the first completely new cattle breed for 200 years.
We were feeders of cattle in the Lothians before the war, and we were always very keen to acquire land to breed our own calves and take them right through and fatten them. And we took over Ardlarach and the island of Lyng in 1947, when we took over a miscellaneous lot of cows. But what we decided to use finally was the Cross Highlander, which is a cross between the Highlander, which is a very hardy breed, and the beef shorthorn, which is a greater depth of flesh. The object of the exercise was really that we could have a cow which was able to live in the climate and environment which they've got up in this part of the world, and also in Scotland and any other uplands, and also to produce a calf which would mature at a reasonable time.
The island where this was to happen isn't one of the wild, remote outposts of the north. It's a pleasant, populated place, only a stone's throw from the mainland. Well, not much more than a catapult throw. This is Lyng.
We chose the island of Lyng not for any particular reason. We were looking for land on the west coast where it was cheap enough on which you could afford to breed beef cattle. One must understand that beef cattle are not an economic proposition to breed on the best of arable ground.
The island is 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, lying north and south off the coast of Argyllshire. As the islands go, it's a gentle spot, green and fertile, and as the islands go, its way of life has taken a fair beating during this century. When the First War began, there were 400 souls on Lyng and 8 farms. The community was virtually self-supporting and fairly self-contained. Its own soil produced all the milk, butter, eggs, potatoes, and cereal crops that the island needed. There was the fishing. There was a vigorous industry of quarrying roof slate. Glasgow University and great areas of Glasgow tenements are still sheltered by slates from Lyng. That first war almost wiped out the young male population, as it did in many of the islands. The brute force of economics swept the slate industry aside. But it was great in its time, and it helped to keep the island throbbing with life. There was even another islet nearby, Belnahua, that was no more than a great lump of pure slate. 50 quarriers lived there with their families and their own shop and their own post office, and over the years they turned the islet into a hollow shell with a wall round it to keep out the sea. The quarriers are dead and gone, and the sea has moved into Belnahua. On Lyng itself today there are a bare 100 people. There is one school. 50 years ago, there were 2. And island children could be taken up to university entrance standard without leaving home at all. Maybe that idyllic kind of island life, if it was idyllic, has to be a casualty of the way we live in this century. The 8 farms of Lyng have disappeared. Barley and bread and potatoes and milk all have to be brought from the mainland. But the island still lives, and in its way it thrives. Lyng lives on beef, and beef lives on Lyng. Small farming has given way to 20th century ranching. To the townie, a cow may be nothing more than a mobile decoration to the landscape or a provocation to bad painters. To the farmer, to the breeder, it is a conversion plant. Its job is to turn the minimum of vegetation into the maximum of meat at the most convenient time. It isn't enough for the animal just to grow big in a hurry. As it puts on weight, the weight should be flesh rather than bone, and the flesh should be lean rather than fat. This is the beginning of an assembly line. And the other end of that line is more and more likely to be a supermarket where the buyer expects a standard product without variation. Lyng cattle may vary in color, but today's trendy beef herd keeps on turning out calves that will grow to the same size, in the same time, with the same shape and the same taste. The ancient island is a precision engineering factory. Without that kind of precision and dependability, the Cadzow brothers could never have got the new breed launched and accepted in what is really a very short time, not much more than a decade.
All our cattle are outside. Bulls, heifers and cows are all outside, and everything is carved outside. Bulls are kept outside. We keep 7 different families on the island. We started that right from the beginning so that we could put the females back into their own families and cross our bulls over from the other families.
This separation of the herd into families lets the Cadzows breed ahead and avoid inbreeding. And as the generations emerge, they live a fairly rugged life, because the breeders expect to sell Lyng cattle to commercial farmers with no time for frills. No animal gets special treatment because special treatment would mask individual differences. Nature and heredity still have to operate, and quality has to emerge on its own. One of the families is grazed on another island, and when the cattle are brought back to Lyng for periodic inspection or treatment, they make both journeys under their own power, even if they don't fancy it too much. The men who had the courage or the arrogance or the imagination to invent a new cow might well have been cautious and unimaginative, because they themselves have been bred through generations of canny Scots farmers. Cadzow is an ancient name in the Scottish lowlands from before the time of King Robert Bruce, who gave the Cadzow lands in Lanarkshire to the Dukes of Hamilton. Maybe the Cadzows themselves had fought on the wrong side. The present generation was raised on the family farm in West Lothian, and all 3 brothers became independent farmers. Shane still works the family farm at Broxburn. Ralph has his own place in Northumberland, and Dennis farms at Pencaitland. Dennis did go briefly to an agricultural college, but he found more interest in practical cattle work in South America, where he lived for a year or so and worked cattle on estancias in the Argentine and Chile. And what the 3 brothers do on their own farms is pretty much what their farmer customers expect to do. They grow cereals for food and fatten up Lyng cattle, which have been raised in the rugged uplands for the first part of their lives. This is sound economics in the beef business. Shane's son Patrick is in the Lyng beef-raising business. Dennis's daughter Sally is the secretary of the Breed Society. This is becoming a sizable job. There are over 100 members of the society now and 70 Lyng beef herds, and the numbers are growing steadily.
after we had done the first mating of our cattle with Lyng Mist, this was our first crossbred bull, as it was then called, and he was Lyng Mist, the first Lyng bull of the breed. We were looking forward to his crop of calves with tremendous anticipation, wondering what they would come like. And they really came, a bunch of about 40 of them, as like each other as peas in the pod. It was a wonderful relief, and excitement was terrific because we appreciated that it could be done. And of course, one had a long way to go at that time. This wasn't fixing a breed, it wasn't just, we weren't home and dried, but we had to go on through many generations after that, inbreeding and line breeding, and very carefully watching the pedigrees. And as they came generation after generation, just as like each other as we wanted them, we suddenly realized after quite a few years that this was really in itself a breed.
This process, incidentally, can't be undertaken casually. The government takes a close and quite proper interest into what is happening to cattle in Britain. From the beginning of the Cadzo experiment, the brothers had to have formal authority from the Ministry of Agriculture to keep a licensed bull. It was years before the recognizable new breed began to emerge. But even this couldn't be described as a distinct breed until it was accepted by the Majesty of Parliament. And the passage through Parliament was fairly long and weary. Parliament, of course, doesn't get this kind of legislation to consider very often. Obviously, with that weight of investment in time and skill and trouble and money, the breed is not neglected. Each calf is an individual with an identity which is worth money in itself. Each is marked individually, and none of them is likely to be overlooked when the time comes for shots, for worms, or any other enemies of healthy beef. The Cadzos take it all very seriously.
It is a responsibility that this nation has towards these lands, and we must see as a nation that we improve more land than we are using up with all other aerodromes, towns, roads, the lot, and forestry where it shouldn't be planted.
This sentiment would have sounded reactionary a few years ago. More and more people are coming round to it now, and it may be absolutely crucial in the way we plan for the future of Britain's land. It may seem odd that an up-to-date animal breeder should sound almost hostile to modern progress. In fact, he is not hostile, merely wary. This experiment is very much a product of this automated century. It couldn't have worked quite the same 100 or even 50 years ago. But however sophisticated farming may become, however rationalized and mechanized, it can't get too far from nature. The most modern breeder has to live with nature, confidently maybe, but with due humility. That is roughly the mixture that got the Cadzos what they wanted.
I would say the biggest disadvantage in Lyng cattle at the moment is they're so scarce.
We went to the Royal Show this year with the intention of letting the breed become known down in the south of England. We had already sent some down to Devon and Yorkshire, but the Royal Show were very keen that we should go down and take a demonstration team down to the show. We don't normally have show animals in classes, but we do give demonstrations.
The kind of thing that interests people at the Royal Show or any other knowledgeable gathering is very much a matter of statistics, like the average daily weight gain of Lyng yearling bulls at 2.63 pounds, or the average height of 47¾ inches at 460 days. But there is still room for simple instinct. The Lyng beasts look good, they look hardy, and they look convincing. And Ling meat had its first promotion at Oban when all the butcher shops and restaurants mounted a saturation public relations job of the new beef. They grow it by 20th century methods and sell it by 20th century methods. And with its arrival at Balmoral, the new breed became much more than merely respectable. The royal family has run cattle on the Balmoral estate for a long time with skill and discrimination, and Ling beef are now included among the royal beasts. In any kind of breeding, quality tells.
Well, of course, I've lived to produce beef cattle, and I think there is nothing more satisfactory than to put out mate a bull with the cows, and the next year to see a good crop of calves coming along, and then 2 years later, we've got a long time to wait in this business, 2 years later to see these steers fat and of the quality you hoped. There is nothing more satisfactory than that.
And Ling beef is undoubtedly a new invention. Granted, it isn't quite as invented as, say, the motor car. All the same, it couldn't have happened without the skill and patience and vision of these human innovators. But it's like a car in that a new model can't be designed simply on the basis of market research and the computer. There's a purely human element, hunch, flair, a knack. And the Ling cattle are very much the product of the Cadzo's hunch. But the job of invention is not over. Times change and tastes change, and the cattle breeder has to predict these changes. Once you invent a cow, you have to keep on inventing it.